What's up, guys? This is Nick from Arch City Poker, and in today's video, going to be continuing the Poker 101 series with today's topic covering range advantage. So, I know that for you guys that watch a lot of my videos or have watched a lot of my videos, this is a concept that I bring up all the time. It is very important. There's a lot of layers to it, and it can become very complex. It can be very troublesome for even the most advanced players in the world as far as knowing what strategies to implement on the table. For the sake of this video, and like all videos in the Poker 101 series, this is going to be much more simple and much more geared towards novice players, players that are just learning how to play, players that are trying to build their games from the ground up and become much more fundamentally sound. This is going to be, I'm going to deliver this in a much more simple way so that you guys can understand it. And it is also going to be for players that maybe do not have access to pieces of software like PO Solver or Card Runners or Poker Snowy. Those really advanced pieces of software, they obviously can spit out who has the range advantage very quickly for you. You don't have to do all this work. You just punch in ranges and then it spits it out and it lets you know. And then you can develop strategies from there on. For you guys, though, that don't have any of this software, like maybe you don't take your game seriously enough yet to consider it. Maybe you just don't want to pay for it. Maybe you can't afford it, and that's fine. It doesn't matter. The point is that you guys still need to understand the concept of range advantage. And I'm going to give you two quick little ways to kind of know and to help you feel a little more comfortable with knowing who has the range advantage. So, what is range advantage, first of all? It is simply who is pushing more equity with their range. Even more simply, who has more combinations of strong value hands and strong draws in their range. Whoever has it, that player's going to have the range advantage, simply put. So, two ways that I think you guys can apply this to the felt and to not overwhelm yourselves, keep things very simple, as I always stress. One, tighter and more stronger ranges are going to usually have the range advantage on most flop textures when you are facing a very wide and weak range. Whether that wide or weak range is raising pre-flop or calling pre-flop, the player with the tighter and stronger range is going to have the range advantage more often. Now, of course, there's certain flop textures that this won't be the case. Pre-flop open raising ranges are, those players are not going to have the range advantage on like 6 high boards, for example, against a player that has a reasonable flatting range in position, simply because that early position pre-flop raiser is not going to have any 2-pair plus. Therefore, the player in position who doesn't miss as often as the player from out of position, and they possibly can be perceived to have 2-pair plus in their range, that player is going to have the range advantage. Like I said, that's not always the case on flop textures, but the player with the stronger and more narrow and more reasonable range, they're going to have the range advantage more often than really weak and wide ranges. And the reason I bring up really weak and wide ranges is for you guys that play live low stakes and play live online games, players flat too often. From in position, out of position, they flat with too many hands. You guys have seen it. You've seen players that flat with stuff like Queen 3 suited for 5 or 6x. They flat with stuff like Ace 6 offsuit. If they're flatting with those kinds of hands, they're flatting with all kinds of hands. And they're just going to be missing flop textures way too often for them to ever have a range advantage. So if you play pretty reasonable pre-flop and your opponent is very out of line and very loose and very wide with their range, you're pretty much always going to have the range advantage. Albeit a few different kinds of board textures where they're going to probably have a little bit of a range advantage where they can represent 2-pair plus a little better than you can. But still, keep that tip in mind. Just think about the pre-flop action and how both of your ranges hit the flop texture. Really wide and weak ranges just simply don't hit flop textures hard enough. Now, if you have a player in that example where you're the pre-flop raiser and you have a player that calls you in position with a strong and reasonable range, then it depends a little bit more. And if you guys don't know, and if there's a board texture where you're going to say, well, Nick, what about like Jack 8-4, for example? Both of us could have, like I'm the pre-flop raiser out of position. I have a strong range, but the pre-flop raiser in position is a tight and tough player. He should have a pretty strong range because he's not that wide. If you guys don't know right away who has the range advantage, then just simply think about who has the nuts more often in their range. who has more nuttish equity. I think that's a concept that players do not think about often enough. And just simply think, who has top pair plus more often? On Jack 8-4, who has the combos of overpairs? Who has more combos of sets? That player's going to have the range advantage. And the bottom line of this video, and what to take away from those 2 quick tips to help you guys feel a little more comfortable with range advantage and being able to figure out who has it. Whoever has the range advantage, that player should be betting more frequently. It just makes sense that the player who's pushing more value should be trying to build the pot more often. The player with the range disadvantage, he should be playing a little more cautiously. He should be checking more often, especially from out of position. And for you guys that have seen a lot of my videos before, players c-bet far too frequently from out of position these days. They, especially on board textures that they do not have the perceived range advantage on. I see players as the pre-flop raiser, out of position, c-betting boards basically like 10 high or less. So like 10 high boards, 8 high boards, 6 high boards. I see players c-betting these boards as the pre-flop raiser way too often. And they just simply miss this board texture too often to be c-betting as frequently as they are. And they aren't going to have the range advantage at that point against a player that has any kind of reasonably strong flatting range in position. That player in position is not only going to have the range advantage, but the ability to realize their equity much more often and to not allow the player from out of position to realize their equity. So I think that's very important to keep in mind as far as that second tip goes. Who has more nuttish hands? And going back to tip 1, tight and weak ranges. Tight and strong ranges hit most flop textures pretty well, and they're going to have the range advantage over wide ranges more often than not. So keep those 2 things in mind. I think that if you guys start to think about the game in that way and you start to implement those 2 tips, you'll start to feel more comfortable. You'll start to decipher who has the range advantage more often, and then you'll be able to decide if you should be betting or checking based on if you have the range advantage or not more often. So I know that was a mouthful at the end there, but yeah, I hope you guys kept up with me. I hope it wasn't too advanced. If you guys have any questions or comments, as always, just let me know in the comment section. This is Nick from Arch City Poker. Take care.